Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Jefferson City Public Library Adult Summer Reading Program. Today we have with us Bob Jarnigan, the Jefferson County historian and truly engaged community member, and he's going to be speaking to us today about the history of Dandridge. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you. Been asked to talk about the history of Dandridge, and if I want to talk about the history of Dandridge, a lot of this is going to be the history of Jefferson County too. So it can involve your history here in Jefferson City as well as the Dandridge history. Some of it will be specific to Dandridge, but a lot of it will be all of our history. I prepared somewhat of a timeline of events that bring us from the earliest days up to close to the present in the Dandridge history. And I like to think of the beginnings of Dandridge as just being a small western outpost on the banks of the French Broad River. It had a very strategic location. It was located between the Great Indian Warpath Trail, which was the major path going out into the wilderness from the colonies down through this area. It came down through the Shenandoah Valley and went right through the middle of what would become Jefferson County. And most of the early explorers used this path. And then to the south of us was the French Broad River. There's abundance of freshwater springs in the area, and those conditions led it to be a very logical campground for the Native Americans and for the Long Hunters later, who came and explored from the colonies. They were some of the earliest explorers that came over here across the mountains and explored the new western lands. They were called Long Hunters because oftentimes their hunts would be a year or so at a time, and they were coming into the area to trap and to hunt for hides and pelts to take back to the colonies and sell, and they also used these hides and pelts to trade with the Cherokee Indians, who this was considered their sacred hunting ground. And so they wanted to get along with Cherokee over here. And they were the ones who brought the news back to the colonies. They were the first ones that brought the news back about what was over the mountains. Can you imagine the Great Smoky Mountains and the rivers and all the abundance of game and unclaimed land? What an exciting area it must have been. I've got something in my pocket here that has to do with the Long Hunters. What is our slang? What is the slang term for this today?
A buck?
It's a buck. It's a buck. Yeah. And that goes to the days of the Long Hunters because the buckskin was the measure of value for the Long Hunter. And the deer was the major hide that they were after, and so they traded with the Cherokee extensively with the buckskin. And our slang comes from that. Now they also hunted the doe, and history says that being a smaller animal that she was hunted also, but it took 2 doe skins to equal the value of 1 buckskin. So I have a buck, or I got a bunch of doe. And that's where our terms come from. And so many things that we use today harken back to those pioneer days. And a lot of times we don't even know it. How many of your parents might have said early when you're going to bed with your kid, sleep tight and don't let the bed bugs bite? Sleep tight was the days of when you slept on an old feather bed that was on a rope, between frames. And if you tightened up the ropes, you had a firmer bed. And that's where sleep tight comes from. Terms like that we use all the time and often don't know. So the Long Hunters were taking back the news of what was over here across the Blue Ridge Mountains, but technically that land wasn't available for settlement until after the American Revolution in 1783. And prior to that, this was the Washington District, and it was a huge area. In 1783, they opened up the lands, the western lands. North Carolina established Greene County. Greene County went to the Mississippi River. Most of the state of Tennessee was 2 early North Carolina counties, and we fell in Greene County. And you can imagine the difficulty governing such a vast land. The settlers over here were on the edge of the frontier, and the Cherokee weren't very happy about it. Oftentimes you had roving bands of Cherokee attacking the frontier settlements, and the only protection they had was groups of them to band together and try to protect themselves. So they're paying taxes to North Carolina in Raleigh. And they're seeing little effect out in the wilderness on the frontier. And so there was talk among the people that lived around Jefferson County, particularly near Dandridge, about maybe we need to pull away and form a new state. So the next period that I want to talk about is a 4-year period, 1784 to 1788. And it's one of the most fascinating periods of our Jefferson County history. At that time, what was going to become Dandridge fell in a county called Caswell County, state of Franklin. And what happened was, North Carolina, at the close of the Revolution, realizing their difficulties in governing such a vast territory, was in communications with the Continental Congress to cede their western properties back to the Continental Congress. Well, when the news got over here to this area in the frontier, the people here that had already thought, maybe we'll just form our own state, they sprang into action. Some of the movers and shakers of the Franklin movement were from the Dandridge area. George Doherty lived down in Shady Grove. Alexander Outlaw up at the bend of the Nolichucky was one of the early formers of the state of Franklin. And these people banded together. I think there was about 8 counties that made up the state of Franklin, from western North Carolina down just a little bit past Jefferson County into Knox County and Blount County. And they elected John Sevier, the governor of the state of Franklin. They patterned their constitution after the North Carolina Constitution. They had a courthouse in Jonesboro first, later was moved to Greenville. And for 4 years, Dandridge operated in Caswell County, state of Franklin. It went before Continental Congress for a vote. Are we going to be the 14th state? And it missed by 2 votes, getting the 2/3 majority. We almost were living in the state of Franklin instead of the state of Tennessee here. And so the movement lasted about 4 years. It eventually fell apart. It's called the Lost State of Franklin, is what you often hear it referred to. And that's because Governor Tipton of North Carolina, when he heard about the movement, quickly withdrew his offer to cede the properties to the Continental Congress and took it back under the authority of North Carolina. So for those 4 years, you had the people in this area thinking they're living in Franklin. North Carolina's still claiming it, and they fought over it. Governor Tipton and Governor Sevier had actually some heated arguments and some little battles over this thing. And Tipton's soldiers raided the courthouse at Franklin and destroyed every document. So there's no documents left in the state of Franklin, and it is said that the only artifact remaining is the key to the front door of the courthouse, the state of Franklin. And so a fascinating period. It falls apart late 1788, and what happens then is the North Carolina then steps up and completes their cede of their western lands to the Continental Congress, and this area of Dandridge and Mossy Creek become the Southwest Territory, or officially the territory south of River Ohio. So William Blount is elected the governor of the Southwest Territory. And the area is starting to grow because people are coming over here, and the soldiers from North Carolina are coming over and exercising their land grants that they received for their service during the American Revolution, and they're starting to settle. Most of the earliest was settled along the Grady and Warpath Trail, and the population grew to the point that by July of 1792, there was enough population for Governor Blount to carve out 2 new counties over here. Jefferson County was formed then, and Knox County was formed at the same time. Now, what's our first order of business when we have a new county being formed? We need to seat a government, don't we? Where are we going to build our courthouse and our jail to operate our new county? So what they did is they elected the commissioners from all around the new county of Jefferson, and Jefferson was named for Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson. And the commissioners met in all of the most likely areas. I'm sure a meeting took place over here in Mossy Creek. There was a meeting up at the bend of the Nolichucky. There was a meeting that took place down in Shady Grove, which was one of the early settlements. And one of those meetings took place in what is now downtown Dandridge. It was at Reverend Henderson's lower meeting house. The first church in Jefferson County. The earliest church was organized in 1785, and this is during the period of the state of Franklin in 1785 by the Scots-Irish, which were the biggest nucleus of early settlers into this area, were the Scots-Irish, and they brought the Presbyterian Church from Scotland with them. And so you can follow a path of the Presbyterian churches down the Shenandoah Valley, down that Great Indian Warpath Trail into East Tennessee, and you can just see the path of migration by those early Presbyterian churches that were being built. And they built a little log church there in what's now downtown Dandridge, in what we call the Revolutionary War graveyard today. And those commissioners met in Reverend Henderson's lower meeting house. This was in January of 1793 when this meeting took place. And I mentioned the Scots-Irish had built the church building. And there's a legend behind Dandridge being picked as the county seat of the newly formed Jefferson County. And it's got something to do with the Scots-Irish again. And I'll ask you, what else are the Scots-Irish known for? Scotch whiskey. They went back into the hills and valleys of Scotland where they set up their stills and brewed Scotch whiskey. Well, they were doing that here too. And the big spring back down behind over the hill from the church building supposedly has a Scots-Irish still operating off it from the main spring in what would become downtown Dandridge. And according to legend, during the meeting in Reverend Henderson's lower meeting house, mind you, they went down and got him a sample of some of the spirits from the still down there by the spring. They brought it in and they poured some and passed it around. And the meeting took a while, and they were sampling the spirits from the spring. And this is some good brews, some good spirits. And being good Scots-Irishmen, they knew that it took good water to make good whiskey. And so they decided those 7 big springs down in that low valley that makes up Dandridge was a good water source, and you needed a spring near all the main buildings and the people that would come and build their houses in the area. And supposedly it influenced them to some degree to declare Reverend Henderson's lower meeting house as the proper place for the county seat. Now, the facts of the matter are it was centrally located in the new county, and you had the French Broad River right there on the banks of the French Broad, and that would be important for shipping and traveling. And the biggest nucleus of settlers were in that area. You already had a church established, you already had a burial ground established, and so that combined with their influence of the good whiskey brought the county seat to Reverend Henderson's lower meeting house. But the commissioners had to come up with a proper name. I don't think they wanted to go down in history being called Reverend Henderson's lower meeting house. So they did something that I think was very progressive for their day in 1793. Think about the names of the other areas. Jefferson County's named for Thomas Jefferson. Washington County for George Washington. Knox for General Knox. Cocke County for William Cocke. These are all men, aren't they? And the settlers in Dandridge honored a woman. Martha Dandridge Custis Washington, the first lady of our country, George Washington's wife, from Virginia. Her maiden name is Dandridge, and they honored her by naming the new county seat of Jefferson County Dandridge. It's the only town in our country named Dandridge, and I think it tells us a lot about the caliber of the people who were settling here, that in 1793 that they honored a woman with the name of the new town, and it makes me very proud that they did that. So now we're operating as Jefferson County, Southwest Territory. We're not even officially a state at this point. And it's 1796 when the state of Tennessee comes along. So here's an example. My ancestor, Captain Thomas Jarnigan, lived in the Watauga settlement during the American Revolution, and he was at the Battle of Kings Mountain. He served on the frontier militia. He came to this area in 1783 when it was officially opened up for settlement, built his log cabin right on the banks of Long Creek where it empties into the Nolichucky. And so he lived in that same cabin And he lived in Greene County, North Carolina, Caswell County, state of Franklin, Jefferson County, Southwest Territory, and Jefferson County, Tennessee. He never moved out of that one log cabin. So can't you imagine the confusion on the frontier in politics and governance? It must have been a very exciting time for those people. Now Dandridge starts to grow. You've got people coming down the trail. The Great Indian Warpath Trail connected the Creek Nation in the south, which was in Georgia and Alabama, with the Iroquois Nation in upstate New York and a branch over in Ohio. And so it was the major thoroughfare footpath through the area and comes to the middle of our county right near Dandridge. You also had flatboats and steamboats coming along later, traveling up and down the French Broad River and bringing travelers into the area. There was a branch of the stagecoach route that went from Knoxville to Abingdon, Virginia, and on to Washington City that passed down Main Street to Dandridge. So there was a lot of travelers, there was a lot of need for overnight lodging in downtown Dandridge for those reasons, and also for the size of the county. Jefferson County was first formed, was much bigger than it is today. All of Sevier County came out of Jefferson County, all of Cott County, and the southern half of Hamlin County was Jefferson County until 1870. So all of that was part of our original county. Our first sheriff, Robert McFarland, lived up at the bend of the Nolichucky, and he was 25 miles from the county seat in Dandridge, and he rode a horse on trails through the woods to come to work. So I don't imagine he came to work and went back home the same day, did he? He had to have a place to stay, and he wasn't the only one. There was a lot of people like that. So big need for lodging, and so therefore some of the first businesses that sprang up were taverns or inns in downtown Dandridge. We had one of the really nice landings on the French Broad River. The Holston apparently could not be navigated by the steamboats unless the river was very, very high. Rarely did they come up the Holston, but they came up regularly the French Broad, and I've seen pictures of them completely loaded down with people coming and going from Shady Grove, Dandridge, Oak Grove, the stops along the way, but Dandridge was the main stop. And this was the shipping route in those days. This is where all your goods were being brought to Dandridge and being put on those flatboats and steamboats and being shipped downstream. But all that changed in 1858, which is our next date. In 1858, the railroad was being built through Jefferson County. And you know what you got over here in Jefferson City, don't you? You've got the railroad tracks. It went through Mossy Creek. And now the center for shipping shifted from the French Broad River over here to Mossy Creek to the railroad tracks. So commerce in Dandridge began to slow down, but Dandridge was still very important as our county seat. So people were still, coming and going on a regular basis, and it was still very, very, very important as our county seat. Next period I want to get into is the period of the Civil War, 1863-64. There was a Battle of Dandridge, there was a Battle of Mossy Creek. I'm going to concentrate on the Battle of Dandridge since we're talking about Dandridge history here today. The events surrounding the Battle of Dandridge had to do with General Longstreet. He'd come off of a major victory down in Chickamauga, and he was ordered to lay siege to Knoxville. General Burnside and the Union held Knoxville. 24,000 troops were holed up around Knoxville. So they circled Knoxville, laid siege to it, and it was unsuccessful. They were not able to take Knoxville from the control of the Union, and winter was upon us. So General Longstreet was ordered to winter over his troops in this valley of East Tennessee. So he marched east out of Knoxville, crossed the Holston River, and marched through Jefferson County, and wound up headquartering in Russellville, which is in Hamlin County, but remember at this time it is Jefferson County. So he winters over in Jefferson County with 20,000 troops. Coldest winter on record, 29 degrees below zero was recorded that winter, and these troops were ill-equipped. It was a very, very tough winter. But with 20,000 troops on one side and 24 on the other, and Jefferson County and Dandridge right in the middle, there was a possibility of a major battle taking place. But these troops were interested in survival. They needed shelter, they needed heat and warmth, and they needed food. And where they found their food was on the French Broad River bottoms around Dandridge. The corn in those days they left on the stalk. They didn't harvest it all, they left it there all year round, and they would come during the winter and take what they needed. Well, the troops found that out. And so Longstreet's troops were foraging the French Broad River bottoms for food from Shady Grove, Dandridge, Oak Grove, all the way up to Newport was their plan. They had 20,000 troops to feed and all their horses to feed. There were some scouts from the Union that came up along the French Broad River just south of Dandridge and found out what was going on, and they took the news back to Knoxville to General Burnside, who decided we want that food for ourselves. So they came up in January 15th of 1864 and occupied Dandridge. Dandridge had never seen anything like it. The lights and lanterns were aglow all night long. We had cannons rolling through town. The officers headquartered in the Hines House, which is right in the middle of Dandridge. It's a big two-story frame house there on Gay Street in Dandridge. Dandridge had never seen so much activity. General Sheridan and General Park were the two generals in charge of the Burnside's troops that headquartered in Dandridge. And not only did they want just the food for themselves and their troops, they wanted to run Longstreet out of the valley of East Tennessee. They wanted him out of there. He was a thorn in their sides, and for 2 days they skirmished hilltop to hilltop east of Dandridge, between Hayes Ferry at the river and Dandridge. Nobody ever making much headway. At the end of the day, everybody kind of backed off, and it was about the same as it had started. But there was a false rumor that was afloat that Longstreet was getting ready to get major reinforcements. That combined with this event, which the morning of January 17th, General Sheridan was ordered to go down to the French Broad River and find an appropriate place to build a pontoon bridge. And what they thought was if they got driven out of Dandridge, they could quickly cross the river on a temporary bridge, and then you would knock the bridge down, and the other troops were on the other side. You separate yourself with the river. And that was a defense tactic during the Civil War that was used. So General Sheridan rode down on a foggy January morning. He rode up and down the banks on the north side of the river at Dandridge, and he couldn't even see the other side most of the time. But every once in a while the wind would lift the fog up just enough that he could catch a glimpse of the other side looking down through there. Obviously you're going to pick the best, shortest distance you can find to build this bridge. And so they started their pontoon bridge, they picked their spot, they built their bridge, and they sent a rider across to test it. He disappeared off into the fog. He was gone for a while. He came riding back across the pontoon bridge, and his head was down like this, and he rode up to General Sheridan's commanding officer and said, "General, the pontoon bridge is sound, but we've built it onto an island, and the other half of the river is on the other side. They built it onto Fane Island." Not realizing the other half of the river's over there, not only did they not have the supplies for a second bridge, they didn't have time to build a second bridge. And I can just imagine what it was like when General Sheridan rode back into Dandridge and entered the Hines House to tell General Park the story of the failed pontoon bridge. So that, combined with the news about the reinforcements, they made a plan to slip out under cover of night that night. And so they built up their campfires east of town where the 125th Ohio was stationed, and they were supposed to stay there as the advance guard and trick the Confederates into thinking that everybody was staying for the battle the next day. So at night they slipped out back to Strawberry Plains and Knoxville, and the 125th withdrew early in the morning before daylight. So in the morning, General Longstreet rides into Dandridge. It's deserted. The Union Army is gone. And so the lady at the house at the Hines House, she was a Confederate sympathizer, and she was glad to be rid of those Union soldiers. She invited Longstreet into the Hines House, and I said, "Let me fix you a big breakfast. Glad to have you in town." And they decided to search around And see, maybe the Union in their haste might have left anything behind, some important news, maybe some maps. Well, all they found upstairs was a bottle of Union brandy. They brought that brandy downstairs and they sat down on the kitchen table and they all poured them around. And this story is told on our Civil War Trails marker sign outside that building downtown Dandridge. They did a satirical toast that morning to the Union Army with their own brandy. And so that's a very interesting story that goes with the Battle of Dandridge. You know, what side, the Union or the Confederacy, do you think most of the people in Jefferson County sided with? Who do you think they supported? Union. When I ask that question on a walking tour, I almost always get that answer, Union. I have a document, and I think this is the most accurate document about the sentiments of the people in Dandridge. Hopewell Presbyterian Church, oldest church in the county, PCUSA Church. It's a northern church, okay? In 1866, this is the year after the Civil War is finished, they did a new session book. And in that book, it starts out with a list of the members, the old membership list revised. And what they did to revise it is they went down every name and put an R for rebel or an L for loyal by every name. And I've looked at that book, and it's exactly half and half. Jefferson County was split right down the middle in their loyalties. You had cousins on both sides of the conflict. I have even run into people who in their families had brothers on different sides of the conflict. Jefferson County was torn apart at the seams by this conflict, with two armies wintering over and taking everything they needed in the coldest winter on record. They took the people's fence posts up and burned them for heat. They took every bit of meat they could find, anywhere on any of the farms. People would come up with all kinds of ways to hide their valuables and their food, so the armies couldn't find it. And there are families that have never recovered from that split, even today, in the Dandridge and Jefferson County area. And there's another event. I've always said there's two significant historical events that have impacted the lives of people in Jefferson County and Dandridge. One, the Civil War, and the other is the coming of TVA. So that brings me to my next date, 1942. 1941, TVA's come in and they build Cherokee Dam on the Holston River and form Cherokee Lake. The government TVA had been eyeing the French Broad River for years. I've seen pictures on their website, on the National Archives site from 1938, where they're taking pictures of Dandridge and Shady Grove and all up and down the French Broad River, planning to build a reservoir here. The people of Dandridge fought it tooth and nail. You had the richest farmland in all the county located down there on those French Broad River bottoms. They had the support of Senator Kenneth McKellar during this time, and he was the head of the Appropriations Committee of TVA. So the money never got appropriated. And it fought for years over this, but things changed in 1942. And what changed was the bombing of Pearl Harbor, which brought us into full-scale battle. We declared war on Japan after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And you got aluminum being produced in Alcoa, need for more energy, and the Manhattan Project was underway. The secret city of Oak Ridge was being developed. Do you realize the government bought 60,000 acres of land, developed and built the world's largest complex of buildings in total secrecy? There's not a newspaper article account of it anywhere during that time frame. It was in total secrecy. The secret city was being developed. Well, the government used this opportunity to convince the people around Dandridge that it was their duty, patriotic duty, to do their part to win the war and let Douglas Dam be built and the reservoir be built. Now, the people still didn't buy it. They felt like the land was worth more as an agricultural resource than it was for production of energy. Other dams could have been built that would have produced a similar amount of electricity, but not as quickly. Dandridge was unique because what they did was they brought all the manpower, the equipment from Cherokee over here directly to Dandridge at the Douglas Bluffs and built Douglas Dam on the same plan the Cherokee Dam was built on. They built it in 12 months. This whole project, we're talking about surveying all the land that was going to be flooded, buying the land or buying the easements to it. That brings me to something else I'll tell you when I finish this about Douglas is unique. Tearing down all the buildings or moving them that were going to be under the reservoir. All the trees had to be cut. All the cemeteries had to be relocated. Can you imagine the magnitude of this project? And it was done in 12 months, which was a world record. Another thing that they did different in Douglas that helped convince the people to give in was, instead of buying the land in fee simple, like you have over here in Cherokee and all the other TVA lakes, they bought easement rights or flood rights. So the people still owned their land. It was just part of the year it was going to be flooded. They were still allowed, when the lake went down, to put their crops down there on the land. They owned that land. And some of the old timers I've talked to around Dandridge really believed that they would get their land back one day. And I really think the government used this idea as a way to convince the people to give in and let the dam be built, and give up the fight. So it's unique. Douglas is unique in the use of easements. So the dam is built, and Dandridge almost suffered the same fate as Oak Grove, Shady Grove, Rankin community that wound up under the waters of Douglas Lake. Those communities were early, thriving communities. They're all gone now. Everything had to be moved, torn down, and relocated. And most of those communities never came back to the prominence that they held prior to 1942, when the lake was built. The dam was built. The lake was formed. Dandridge would have suffered the same fate. The waters and the little streams that come down through Dandridge went down through a low area into the French Broad River. Therefore, the lake was going to back up in that same area into the middle of what's now our historic district in downtown Dandridge. The people of Dandridge formed a planning commission. They said, how are we going to deal with this? What are we going to do about this threat of our downtown area? And the people, that planning commission came up with the idea of that dike that's built in Dandridge today. That was not a government idea or a TVA or an Army Corps of Engineers or anything. That was an idea that came out of the planning commission of the town of Dandridge. They presented it to TVA. They presented it to the Army Corps of Engineers. They studied the plan, and they deemed it a very good, worthy, and doable plan. They came in and purchased the Hedrick farm. They headquartered in the Hedrick House, which is Town Hall in Dandridge today, and they had land all along the French Broad River there, about probably 25 or 30 acres of farmland there along the river, and they got all their raw materials and resources off of there, and they built the dike, which holds the water of Douglas Lake out of the middle of Dandridge. But we all got another problem, don't we? What about the water on the other side that's coming down into Dandridge? What are you going to do with that? Because it keeps it from going on through. So they had to build this big concrete pump station in the middle of Dandridge, and all these diversion ditches and drain areas. There's two big tunnels that go underneath the property in town of Dandridge and feed out on the other side of the dike, and the creeks flow through those and through the dike and out into the lake. And the pump station picks up the springs that we talked about, the 7 big springs in town of Dandridge, and they pump the water through the dike and into the lake. And believe me, TVA keeps a close watch on the motors on the pumps down at that pump station, because they know they're in trouble. If they ever fail for very long, we can still flood because the water can't get out of Dandridge. So it's a really interesting dichotomy of holding the lake out, but also holding the water back into the middle of Dandridge. So those two historical events, I still know families in Dandridge today that number one, don't trust TBA, the government, over the takings of their land, you know, during the buildings of these lakes, and then the split in the families during the Civil War. The southern families were left with worthless Confederate money. Land was the only thing they had of any value, and they had debts they'd built up, and they had to give up their land lots of times and move on to pay their debts, and some of them never came back. So next date I've got on here is 1972. I told you commerce had shifted to Mossy Creek when the railroad was built in Jefferson City. And Jefferson City has grown, you've got your college and everything, and Dandridge just kind of stopped in its tracks for a while there. It's still important, you know, the county seat and courthouse, but in 1972, Dandridge was honored by being declared a National Historic District. All of the downtown area is now a National Historic District. George Bowman, former county historian, if there's a mentor for me as county historian, it was George Bowman. You knew him? Yeah, you knew of him. George Bowman, I looked up to George. He was around when I was in college and afterwards, and I helped him with the founding festivals that they did in Dandridge to help raise money to restore the courthouse. When he did that, he did a wonderful job with it. This is a quote that I remember George Bowman saying about Dandridge. Dandridge has been blessed with benign neglect. And what he meant by that was, we got a lot of old buildings here that look kind of bad. They haven't been, some of them hadn't been occupied in 10 or 15 years, but they were intact. The original roofs, the original buildings, windows, door, everything was there, just waiting on somebody to come in there and restore those buildings. He recognized it was a wonderful, wonderful resource. But this was in the 70s. You couldn't hardly give those old buildings away in the 1970s. Nobody wanted them. Today, they're in vogue. People love to come and buy those things and restore the old buildings in our historic district, either live in them or some people live in them and have shops in them. But Dandridge is thriving now as our Jefferson County Center of Tourism. And it's because of the National Historic District, because of the lake, proximity to the Smoky Mountains, our courthouse, you know, if you're wanting to do your family research or anything, you know, the archives office in our courthouse. We've got two major architectural periods represented in the historic district, the 1820s federal period and the mid-1800s Greek revival period, which was represented by our courthouse. Four of those original taverns I talked about are still standing. And Dandridge is quite unique for such a small town to have 4 taverns still standing. Let me tell you a little bit about those 4 taverns. 2 of the earliest ones were the 1817 Roper Tavern, and it's a 2-story brick federal structure, and right there on Main Street. Now, none of these are occupied as taverns anymore. This one is Becky Sloan's law office, is the Roper Tavern. Colonel John Roper was a wealthy planter and land developer out of Virginia that came here, and he operated the tavern. And across the street, when his daughter got married, Mary Roper, who married George Branner, and their son, John Roper Branner, was the builder of the Glenmore over here in Jefferson City. So that has ties back to Dandridge with the Branner family. And he built them as a wedding gift the 1821 Roper Mansion, which is right across the street, which was one of our premier federal homes still standing in our historic district. The other older one is where I just had lunch before I came over here, which is Shepherd Inn. This was originally a 2-story log cabin right there on the corner of Graveyard Alley and I think it's called Broad Street in those days, but it's Main Street today. In 1823, Shadrach Inman bought that property, and through the years, Shadrach and Sarah added on and built what you see today, which is kind of a Victorian inn look. It was the premier inn and stagecoach stop in the early days of Dandridge during the stage route. 3 early presidents have stayed in that inn. Andrew Jackson, Andrew Johnson, and James K. Polk all stayed in the 1820s, 1830s when they were traveling by stage, stayed in that inn. Dandridge was a happening little place in the early 1800s, wasn't it? Can you imagine if a president came and stayed in Dandridge today, what that would mean? But it was apparently fairly common during that time as they were traveling on the stage route. So that's 2 of our 4 taverns. The other 2, are going to be our town hall. Our town hall today, which is called Hickman Tavern, was actually built in the 1820s by John Fane. The Fane family built this it's a 5-bay federal building. It's occupied by Town Hall. TVA, this is the one that they headquartered in when they built the dike and built the bridge in Dandridge. So they gave it back to the town of Dandridge with the stipulation it'd always be used for public use. So it's housed the Dandridge Library. It's housed the Masonic Lodge. The city offices are in it. So they're allowed to use it. It's one of the most beautiful buildings in Dandridge. The 4th one is the Thomas Tavern. Now, all of downtown Dandridge early on, when it was, remember, it was the church in 1785, and it didn't become Dandridge until 1793. And so Francis Dean, who owned the land and provided it for the new town of Dandridge when it was organized, he reserved 3 acres for what they called church land in the middle of town. Now Dandridge is laid out just like Jonesboro, Greenville, Rogersville. All of them are laid out very similar. They have the central square, and around it you have a grid of streets with rectangular shaped lots that are sold off. Where Dandridge is unique is the central square in all these other communities is the courthouse, the public buildings. In Dandridge, it was reserved for the church land. So they own 3 acres in town. Now, a good part of that was the graveyard that remains there today. But, and I think Dandridge may be the only community in East Tennessee that has this designation of church land as its central square. But the church moved out in 1843 because it'd gotten overgrown with a little log church building down there. And when they moved out, they started selling off church land lots. And so in 1843, James Mitchell bought a corner lot there, which is on the corner of Meeting Street and Gay Street, and built his tavern, which is our 4th tavern. It is now the Thomas Tavern Gift and Smoke Shop. It occupies it today. So those are your 4 original taverns, and Dandridge is very, very special and unique to have 4 of them still remaining. I mentioned I just had lunch at the Shepherd Inn. The Shepherd Inn went through various ownerships through the years. The Inmans, the Mitchells, the Shepherds, became a private residence later, and the current owners spent several years after buying the property and restored it back to its original glory. It's a bed and breakfast now. And that's just what downtown Dandridge needs to sort of is a bed and breakfast inn. And on Thursdays, they serve lunch in downtown Dandridge. You must make a reservation. Mr. Jim Everett, the innkeeper, wanted me to remind you, if you want to go, you got to call, make a reservation. But on Thursdays, you can go in and sit at the dining room table where those presidents sat and ate their dinner when they stayed there in the 1820s. And it gives you a wonderful feeling. They did a beautiful job restoring the old Shepherd Inn as their bed and breakfast. So we've gone from the earliest beginnings of Jefferson County, the first settlers coming in 1783. We've gone through the Civil War period, the impact of TVA. We've come up to the National Historic District. So that's my story in the history of Dandridge. But being the summer reading program, I feel like I must mention some books here. So if you want to read a little bit about the things I've been telling you about and a little bit more about our county's history, not just Dandridge, but our county, I will suggest some things for you. There are 2 books that I know of that have been written on the lost state of Franklin. So if you're interested in that period, Amazon's got them. The library may have them. The Dandridge, I think the Dandridge Library may have one in the reference section. I don't know if you can check it out. But anyway, there's 2 books that have been written on the lost state of Franklin. 2 of my favorite books that give you a real feel for this area during the pioneer days is a book by Brenda Calloway called America's First Western Frontier. A Story of the Early Settlers and Indians of East Tennessee. It's a pretty good read. Also, our famous author from Cotton County, Wilma Dykeman, The French Broad. Lovely book. And did you know that after her death, they discovered a typewritten manuscript that she had done when she was young, and it's just come out. It's called Family of Earth, A Southern Mountain Childhood. And so they developed it into a book with the approval of her family, and it's an amazing read considering how young she was when she wrote it. So you might want to look for that. If you've already read The French Broad, you might want to look for the Family of Earth. So, and there's some local ones. We've got the Historical Society has a little book that I sell a lot of the visitors that come through. Heritage Jefferson County. It was a cool little book that was developed called Broken Hearts, Broken Lives that you can find, and it's a collection of stories through the history. Most of them are centered around the Civil War period. It's the name Broken Hearts and Broken Lives. But there's a pretty good collection of stories in there about the life in Jefferson County and the Dandridge area. So I'll leave you with that, and I'll open up the floor for any questions you might have.
Thank you.